Hi, this is History with me, Dan. In this video, I'm going to talk about some buildings that once stood near the riverfront in the city of Hartford, Connecticut. They were built during Hartford's heyday as a river port and were lost to redevelopment in the first decade of the 20th century. Today, the riverfront of Hartford, nearest to downtown, is a relatively quiet place, separated from the rest of the city by the interstate highway. One place where the urban landscape has been reconnected to the water is at Mortenson Riverfront Plaza, which links above the highway to the Connecticut Science Center and the nearby Convention Center. 185 years ago, when this scene was painted in 1841, the riverfront area was quite different. The river was the highway, a busy conduit for sailing ships and early steamboats, carrying cargo and passengers to the many wharves and warehouses along the river's bank. The streets leading away from the river towards downtown were filled with the businesses of merchant traders, and there were inns and numerous taverns. In the days before the railroads, or even before there was a bridge over the Connecticut here, travelers crossed to the city by ferry from East Hartford. Almost a century later, even after the construction of the Bulkley Bridge, many still arrived by steamboat at the foot of State Street, and then went westwards towards the old State House and Main Street. That's why the main entrance to the old State House is not on the west side of the building, facing Main Street, but on the east side, facing the Connecticut River. The process that transformed the bustling waterfront of the early 19th century into what we are familiar with today took several generations, but there were a number of critical moments of change. One of these was the building of the Bulkley Bridge, when old coal and freight yards along the river were swept away, and a section of the old Commerce Street was replaced with the new Connecticut Boulevard. This thoroughfare joined the new bridge to the foot of State Street. On the left is a section of the 1896 Atlas of Hartford. It shows that at that time there was still standing a row of structures associated with Hartford's early days as a river port along Commerce Street, between State Street on the south and Ferry Street on the north. On the right is the same area depicted in the 1909 Atlas. It shows that the old buildings had been replaced. Luckily, they were photographed before they were taken down, and their histories were recalled in the Hartford Courant newspaper before they were lost forever. Keep watching this video to learn about these buildings and the old days along the Connecticut River in Hartford, Connecticut. From its earliest days, the city of Hartford, Connecticut, was vitally connected to the Connecticut River. 200 years ago, the city's waterfront was crowded with ships, and its warehouses were filled with produce and merchant goods. Hartford was incorporated as a city in 1784, and its original seal, adopted the following year, features a representation of the river as an old man crowned with rushes, who holds an urn with a stream gushing from it and a net filled with fish. Nearby are bushels and barrels. As William Deloss Love wrote in his 1914 book, The Colonial History of Hartford, quote, "There is no more appropriate device in which to symbolize the sources of Hartford's early development than this first seal. It sets forth the indebtedness of the town to the Connecticut River, that was the great highway to their settlement from the outside world. To it they committed many a venture for distant ports. It provided their tables in season with the choicest fish, it fertilized their meadows, and it brought to their homes many coveted luxuries. Thus it was the main artery of their early life." Unquote. This is a section of Love's map showing the early house lots of Hartford north of the Little River in 1635. The growing town's earliest wharves and warehouses were located in the vicinity of what was known as the Landing Place, Hartford's original ferry landing that was connected westwards across the Little Meadow to the road that ran from the Little or Park River on the south to the North Meadow. This north-south road would later become Front Street and is now called Columbus Boulevard. During the colonial period, though, the warehouses were relatively small, and the commercial activity along the river was still limited compared to what would come in the years after the Revolutionary War. This section of the 1824 Plan of Hartford shows that by that time, during the heyday of Hartford's river trade, there were 20 wharves between the mouth of the Little River at Dutch Point to Morgan's Bridge on the north, which was the city's first bridge across the Connecticut. It opened in 1809, approximately where the Bulkley Bridge is located today. Zooming into the center of this area, by this time, the colonial path to the ferry landing was known as Old Ferry Street. It would later be renamed Kilbourne Street. Just to the south was a new Ferry Street, which led to a second public landing place and ferry established in the 18th century. An engraving which appeared on early policies of the Hartford Fire Insurance Company depicted a fire in a building at the foot of Ferry Street in 1811. As the Hartford Current noted retrospectively almost a century later, quote, "The foot of Ferry Street was one of the busiest places in the city. The ferry, landing the farmers from the east side of the river who, with all their produce, gathered in the locality to barter and trade. The big warehouses down there were built in 1808, but the ferry was run long before the original bridge was built. Much business was transacted at the ferry, for besides being a gathering place for farmers who had produce to sell and who came to town to make purchases, it was also the headquarters of rivermen and fishermen, and there was a Fulton Street market on a small scale there." Unquote. The view in the image is eastwards towards the Connecticut River. Shown on the riverbank is an example of the shipbuilding activity that was flourishing at the time. In the distance, the image depicts the 1809 bridge across the Connecticut River, depicted here in a later imagining of what the area might have been like. It lasted less than a decade. Part of the bridge collapsed under the pressure of ice in March of 1818. Ferry Street was originally known as Jones Lane. By the late 18th century, 25 acres of land south of Jones Lane and east of Front Street were known as Pantry Jones's Pasture. Named for John Pantry Jones, the land had been amassed starting with his great-great-grandfather, William Pantry, one of the original proprietors of Hartford, who'd arrived with Thomas Hooker. The buying up of acreage culminated in the 25 acres owned by John Pantry Jones's grandfather, John Pantry. As William DeLoss Love wrote of Pantry Jones, quote, "His homestead and adjoining pasture occupied a considerable area. It was through the southern part of this tract, then owned by his son, Nathaniel Jones, that Lower State Street was opened in 1800. In 1781, Pantry Jones deeded to Barnabas Dean and Company the lot near the river, long occupied by their distillery and store. Perhaps the latter building was erected earlier by Pantry Jones. This firm was formed in 1779. It is said that General Nathaniel Greene was a silent partner. Northwest of the distillery, there was a blacksmith shop known as Ensign's. Along Ferry and Kilbourne Streets, the greater part of the business life in this section gathered." Unquote. Besides Nathaniel Greene, the other silent partner of Barnabas Dean, who by the way was the brother of Wethersfield's Silas Deane, was the wealthy Hartford merchant Jeremiah Wadsworth. Greene and Wadsworth concealed their involvement due to their prominence in the ongoing Revolutionary War at the time. Barnabas Deane and Company's ships supplied the distillery with molasses produced by enslaved labor in the West Indies. John Pantry Jones was himself a merchant. 2 notices he placed in the Hartford Courant are shown on the left. In one, he and 2 other merchants advertise that they are selling potash kettles and coolers, and in another, Jones describes a black mare he had caught swimming across the Hartford ferry. Quote, "The owner, on proving his property and paying charges, may have her again, of the subscriber at Hartford Ferry, John P. Jones," unquote. According to DeLoss Love, Pantry Jones erected a ferry house at the foot of Ferry Street, which he bequeathed to his nephew, John Jones, in 1794. Now I'll talk about some buildings located on Commerce Street between State and Ferry Streets. First, there were 2 houses, both of 3 stories, shown in this picture in circa 1905. They faced east towards the river and the train tracks, which came through in 1871. In this photograph, from the Samuel Taylor collection at the Connecticut Museum of Culture and History, the houses are numbered 1 and 2. A note on the back of the picture explains that building number 1 was the residence of John Pantry Jones, quote, who kept a store at the corner of Ferry and Commerce Street, known as the Gridiron, who in his later life farmed in South Windsor, unquote. This John Pantry Jones, born in 1791, was the grandson of the John Pantry Jones I was just describing earlier. His son, yet another John Pantry Jones, was born in 1832. A successful farmer, in 1882 he erected a notable stick-style house on Main Street in South Windsor. His brother, Nathaniel Jones, was profiled in a 1933 article in the Hartford Courant on the occasion of his 93rd birthday. The article declared that he was a militant Democrat, having voted for every Democratic presidential candidate from George B. McClellan in 1864 to Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1933. Jones said he was glad to have lived to see another Democratic president in office, reminding him of the days of Grover Cleveland and Woodrow Wilson, and he looked forward to voting for FDR again in 1936. Sadly, Jones passed away in 1934. House number 2 is described as the residence of the father of State Railroad Commissioner John W. Bacon. Born in 1827, his parents were Leverett W. and Sarah Watson Bacon. In his long career working as a civil engineer for various railroads, Bacon completed such projects as the construction of Hartford's Union Station. He later settled in Danbury, Connecticut, where he died in 1907. That was not long after his old family homestead in Hartford was slated for demolition. The Riverfront area had been a prosperous neighborhood in Bacon's youth, with some of the city's finest houses, but by the later 19th century, these residences had become tenements and warehouses. As the Hartford Courant described on September 8, 1905, the former Bacon House, quote, has borne an unsavory reputation in the neighborhood for some time, unquote. Morgan G. Bulkley, head of the commission overseeing construction of the new bridge, was seeking to purchase the house, but its owner wanted $10,000, quote, a sum which surprised the commission. Arguments were used to induce the owner to change his price, but without avail, and Senator Bulkley did not make the trade. It is rumored that the commission will resort to condemnation proceedings in the Superior Court under the law of eminent domain as the commissioners have no intention of paying the price demanded by the owner of the property," unquote. Next to these two old houses was a more recent structure. It was T.J. Blake & Son, Brass Foundry and Copper Works. The business was started by Thomas J. Blake. Born in New York in 1834, where he learned the coppersmithing trade, Blake spent a brief time in Elmira, New York, before coming to Hartford in 1856. After a 5-year period working for Conrad Whitmore on Charles Street and a brief stint for Colt Patent Firearms, Blake in 1861 began his own business, which was located first on Charles Street and then Ferry Street before moving to 141 and 143 Commerce Street in 1895. Tom Blake was a volunteer firefighter and served for 25 years as a fire commissioner, and for 17 years was on the Board of Selectmen. Like Nathaniel Jones, Blake was a lifelong Democrat, casting his first presidential vote the year he arrived in Hartford, 1856, for James Buchanan. Tom Blake retired at the end of June 1905 and passed away 4 months later. His son, Edwin J. Blake, who'd become a partner in the business in 1883, took over and transferred operations to Windsor Street at what's now the corner of Pavilion Street. This was to make way for the demolitions of that year and to increase the size of his facilities. Edwin died in 1925, and the firm was reorganized as the Blake Foundry Corporation. The company went into receivership in 1932 and ceased operations 5 years later. However, its former buildings still survive at the corner of Windsor and Pavilion. Just north of the T.J. Blake & Son property on Commerce Street was a 3-story stone structure at the corner of Ferry Street. Built in 1840, it was Asa Farwell's wholesale and retail liquor store. This photo was taken circa 1905, before the buildings I've just been talking about were torn down. But by the time of this photo, taken in 1906, the Pantry Jones, Bacon, and Blake structures were all gone, leaving only Farwell's old stone building. The demolitions uncovered the rear of the buildings just to the west, which, like the Farwell building, faced northward onto the south side of Ferry Street. This photo shows the Ferry Street side of these buildings. Farwell's Warehouse and the neighboring building on Ferry Street were demolished in early 1907 after being condemned by the city. Around that time, articles in the Hartford Courant recalled the building's early days over a half-century earlier. Quote, "There still live a few old men who once went down to Asa Farwell's stone warehouse to drink cherry bounce for their stomach's sake. The liquid consisted of St. Croix or Jamaica rum, in which wild cherries had been put a few months before." Unquote. Local boys would earn silver coins picking cherries for merchants like Asa Farwell. Some also recalled the velvet suit Farwell wore among his casks of liquor. Quote, "And the customers were allowed to take a glass and help themselves. A dealer in that locality would be ruined now if he followed such a custom." Unquote. Also, quote, "In his day, Commerce and Ferry Streets contained as respectable residences as Main Street itself, but for some years his storehouse has sheltered rags and junk instead of the rare liquors of Asa's day." Unquote. Farwell amassed a substantial fortune, and in 1848 he erected a grand 3.5-story townhouse at the corner of Main and Grove Streets. It was said that the profit from one glass of his famous cherry bounce paid for one brick of the house. Designed by the architect Henry Austin of New Haven, the house cost $75,000, and, according to tradition, Farwell paid the entire sum in advance with money he kept in a wooden chest in his warehouse. The money was in many forms, including gold and silver, as well as American, British, French, and Spanish coinage, and the paper notes of various Hartford banks. The house was later converted to offices, and shortly before Farwell's old warehouse was torn down, the house was taken down for the construction of the first section of what would become Travelers Tower. As for the old warehouse, as I mentioned, it was replaced in 1908 by Connecticut Boulevard. But that was not the end of lost buildings that once existed at this corner of Ferry Street. As shown in this section of the 1922 Sanborn Insurance Atlas of Hartford, a new structure was built in that year right at the curve of Connecticut Boulevard where Farwell's warehouse had once stood. Also shown in this aerial postcard view, the new building was a municipal bathhouse for the use of East Side residents, similar to one that had recently been built in Pope Park. With facilities for 30 baths at one time, 20 for men and 10 for women, it accommodated twice as many people as the previous and inadequate East Side public bathhouse, which had been located in the former quarters of the fire department's Engine Company No. 3 on Front Street. As the Current reported on October 20th, 1922, quote, "The main entrance will be separated, providing a lobby and waiting room for the men and one for women. A distinct advantage over the old building is that there is ample space for waiting room. It was often necessary to form lines on Front Street. A spacious lawn will be graded in front to provide for waiting children. The foundation and roof of the structure are of concrete, and the walls are of brick." Unquote. Of course, this area would be completely transformed in the late 1950s with the construction of Foundry's Bridge and Interstate 91. Even the bathhouse is now long gone. I have other videos about Hartford's lost riverfront that you can watch. Please check them out and hit the like button. And if you subscribe to this channel or join as a member, it would really help me to produce more content like this. Thanks for watching.